Ian Bremmer, the Economist Intelligence Unit, had a piece out which basically spoke of how economic agreement is becoming increasingly difficult for the G20, hamstrung as it is by geopolitical differences, and how the failure to issue a declaration would suggest that the G20 could be losing viability going into the future as the preeminent organization of the world. Would you buy that? How much emphasis would you lay on the need for India as president to produce a communique at the end of these deliberations?
Look, obviously it's important to show that the summit is a success, but I don't think that's the only metric that we judge it by. I agree with Samir that it is essential that the 7 billion people that have not been served by global governance and architecture have spokespeople that are able to drive their interests and force them on the global agenda. And India's chairmanship of the G20 is a significant step in that direction. So in that regard, the issues that are being driven by the Indian government are very important on financing, for example, for climate change. And I see the G20 as potentially more impactful on that than this year's COP summit in Abu Dhabi because of the controversy around it. Lots of other issues in that regard. But one thing we have not mentioned, again, I mentioned Russia, Ukraine briefly, and of course, Modi doesn't want to discuss it, and he says that's only driving countries apart. It's true, but let's be clear. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is not important so much because of Ukraine for the G20. It's important because it's the first time that one of the G20 nations has been made into a rogue by the entire G7. Saudi Arabia approximated that, came close to that, much smaller economy and much less holistic willingness to toss them out after the Khashoggi incident. This is a wholly different concept. This is the G7 taking, in other words, a big component of the G20 saying one of your members is led by a war criminal and we can no longer work with them. And I agree that Russia is still going to be, as Kishore said, an important country in the world. It's just going to be an important country that is seen as a war criminal. That's a real problem for the G20. That's a real problem for the development of the global economy. I mean, for gas flows, for food, for fertilizer. There's a deal that they're trying to get back on the table today with Turkey, unlikely to occur. And so the interference of geopolitical trends, of which the biggest near-term crisis has been the Russian invasion, but there are many, many more, with economic development is a principal spanner in the works of how we can continue to drive cooperation in the face of really big global challenges. You need global responses, but nobody believes that we have effective global responses right now, not to COVID, not to climate, not to technology, not to the Russia war. And that's a very, very principal challenge, not just for the G20.
I'm running out of time on this roundtable, but I want to go across for one final question each. And Kishore Mehbubani, I'll start with you. One of Prime Minister Modi's big attempts has been to position India as the voice of the global South during his G20 presidency. Now, China, over the past several years, has been working towards emerging as the leader of the global South. Is this where an India-China contestation is now shaping up, where India, through its efforts to onboard the African Union as a permanent member of the G20, is trying to give the global South a voice, whereas China sees itself as the natural leader of the global South? How do you see this play out?
Well, I think it's good that both China and India are competing to be leaders of the global South, because the voice of the global South, as Samir said very clearly earlier, has not been heard. And you asked about Ukraine earlier. You interviewed Prime Minister Modi, and I remember in the interview you asked Prime Minister Modi, "What are you going to do about Ukraine?" And what was Prime Minister Modi's response? He says, "Why do you mention Ukraine only? Aren't there wars in Syria? Aren't there wars in Libya? Aren't there wars in other parts of the world? Why do you focus on one war?" And this is where Foreign Minister Jaishankar was very wise. He said, Europe thinks that Europe's problems are the world's problems. But the world's problems are not Europe's problems. That's why it's good that India is vying for leadership of the global south, because there's so many more issues than Ukraine in the world. Yes, Ukraine is important, but come on, 88% of the world's population lives outside the West, and 85% of the world's population has not imposed sanctions on Russia.
Interesting. I want to go to Samir on the issue of the BRICS and the SCO. India at this moment is in this position where it's president of the G20, is a key part of the Quad, is furthering ties with the United States, and yet is a member of the SCO, which obviously they didn't put the kind of soul into because the SCO summit this year was held virtually by India. We're part of BRICS, which has now been expanded. At some point in time, Samir, do you see India having to choose between, say, being a part of the Quad, being a part of the G20, and wanting to continue playing a role in the SCO or BRICS, which China clearly wants to dominate and set the agenda for?
So, Rahul, I want to come to that question. It's a great question. Let me answer that. But before that, I just want to add something to points made both by Ian and Kishore. Let's put a counterfactual here. Just a thought, and I'll leave it there. Let us all come up with our own answers. If the invasion of Iraq by George Bush Jr. had taken place a few years ago, and the leaders' summit of the G20 was already underway. Actually, when the invasion took place, G20 at the leaders' level did not exist. But if it had happened in the last few years, how would George Bush have been treated by the G20? And that's just a thought we should all process. How would the world have responded to a blatantly unfair war imposed on proud people, the destruction of democracy? And that's something we must think about. Could we have responded in the same way? And if we did, then perhaps we are in the right direction. If we would have responded differently, then we are just letting our biases play out. That's just one thought, Rahul. On the BRICS and SCO, on the BRICS, and both of them are very different organizations. SCO, we are a late joiner. And I think simply because of our presence in a particular region, we need to be in the tent rather than outside of the tent. What SCO does could have implications on our security and on our economic prospects. We need to be within that grouping, A, to moderate it, B, to prevent any harms coming towards us, and C, to ensure that there is sensible, rational conversations in that particular grouping. BRICS, for that matter, BRICS is another matter altogether. We are a founding member, and let me confirm to you that on that table, when expansion was being discussed, the largest list of countries that was proposed by any country was by India. India wanted the largest number of new entrants, contrary to popular perceptions. And the idea of bringing more people in was to actually strengthen the grouping in a manner in which the right kind of actors with resources and means could participate, or those sit on certain important geographies could contribute. And if you look at the new entrants, you would not find many who would not be equally comfortable with the G7 as they are with the others in the BRICS grouping. So the countries who have come in are not polarizing figures or polarizing countries. They are all countries who are going to contribute to the bridging role that these emerging geographies must play. They are right after the Indian mold, where we believe that we need to be in as many groups as possible, because there are going to be some countries, including the US, including India, including a few others like China and Japan and others, who will have to be in multiple smaller arrangements so that we have a cohesive, larger world order.
Okay, last question, Ian Bremmer. I interviewed Fareed Zakaria a couple of days ago, and one of the things he said about American politics is that no matter who wins, America is headed most certainly into a state of political crisis. He spoke of how if Donald Trump wins or loses, there is likely to be chaos. So given where you sit, could you share with our viewers your reading of what's most likely to happen in America, putting on your risk hat right now?
Look, I mentioned that no one's looking forward to this election, aside from perhaps America's adversaries. It is very likely that this is Biden versus Trump redux. the two incredibly old and also pretty unpopular leaders. And right now they're polling about even. The latest polls show 45 to 46 if Biden versus Trump, which means that we have no idea who would actually win. Trump is more unpopular with independents. We also know that we have 91 indictments against a twice impeached and twice acquitted former President Trump. Everything about this election that is negative is unprecedented in U.S. history. And no matter who wins the election, the losers and the losing side is going to feel this time around that the election is illegitimate. Meaning, if Trump wins, the Biden supporters believe that he shouldn't even be allowed to run, given the crimes that they believe he's committed. If Biden wins, Trump, of course, will rally his supporters yet again to say this was stolen, this was rigged, and he's going to be facing potential jail time. This is all horrible for the United States and, of course, for those that rely on the United States. My final point is that India, at least India, is one country that we know has a trajectory of good and improving relations with both Trump and Biden. So at the bilateral level, at least as long as Modi is there, it does seem like the U.S. election will have less impact on India than it will on many other countries and many other democracies around the world.